The monotonous hum of the data servers was the soundtrack to Reid's life. Day in, day out, he monitored atmospheric pressure and wind speed, a silent sentinel in the small, isolated weather station perched on the fringes of the state park. His existence was a steady, predictable rhythm of numerical inputs and graph interpretations, a stark contrast to the turbulent world the instruments measured. He often found himself staring out the reinforced window at the endless expanse of pine and spruce, wondering if the trees felt as trapped as he did. The air, crisp and sterile inside the station, offered no reprieve from the low-grade thrum of existential ennui that had settled deep in his bones. One Tuesday, just as a cold front began to sweep in from the north, blurring the distant peaks with a haze of impending snow, the station's landline shrilled. Reid, startled by the unexpected sound in the otherwise quiet facility, picked up. A crisp, formal voice, belonging to a legal representative, cut through the static. The caller spoke of an inheritance, a distant relative named Elara, a woman Reid barely recalled from a single, awkward family reunion in his childhood. Elara, the voice explained, had passed suddenly. And he had left everything to him. Everything? Reid echoed, the word feeling hollow in his mouth. He knew nothing of Elara, save for a vague memory of her quiet intensity and the peculiar, almost unsettling way she'd looked at him across a crowded room many years ago. The representative confirmed, his tone dry and professional. A property. A cabin, to be precise. Deep in the Blackwood Forest. Quite secluded. He then rattled off an address that sounded less like a location and more like a series of coordinates to the edge of the known world. There was a pause, a subtle shift in the caller's normally uninflected voice. There are certain conditions. The will stipulates immediate occupancy, Reid. Within 2 weeks. A cabin. Secluded. Immediate occupancy. The words felt like stones dropping into the placid pond of his routine. Reid felt a prickle of something unfamiliar, not excitement, but a tremor of apprehension. Why him? Why this sudden, unburdened legacy from a forgotten branch of his family tree? He agreed to the terms, a decision made less by conviction and more by a strange, magnetic pull he couldn't explain. The conversation ended, leaving behind an echo of the representative's final, almost cautionary remark, "It's a very old place, Reid." Very old indeed. The drive took 2 days, each mile pulling him further from the grid of civilization, deeper into a landscape that grew progressively wilder, less tamed. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then to little more than twin ruts carved into the forest floor. His old pickup truck groaned and bucked, branches scraping its sides, the engine whining in protest as he navigated the increasingly narrow, overgrown track. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a primal aroma that seemed to cling to the very fabric of his clothes. The forest itself began to change. The trees grew taller, their canopies interlocking overhead, filtering the sunlight into fractured shards that barely pierced the gloom. It felt less like a forest and more like a vast, living wall, pressing in from all sides. His shoulders tightened, a knot of unease forming in his stomach. He remembered the representative's words about Elara's cabin, about it being quite secluded, and now, he understood. This wasn't seclusion, it was an exile. There it stood. The cabin. It wasn't grand, or even particularly picturesque. The roof sagged in places, a patchwork of moss and lichen clinging to its worn shingles. A single, crooked chimney stood sentry, smoke-stained and ancient. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Reid cut the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, a physical pressure against his eardrums. He sat for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The air here was different, heavier, charged with an unspoken presence. He swallowed, the dryness in his throat sudden and acute. The cabin didn't look inviting, it looked watchful. This wasn't just a dilapidated old building. It felt like something had been waiting. And now, he had arrived. His old pickup truck groaned and bucked, branches clawing at its paint, the engine protesting with every jolt. The twin ruts had become a single, overgrown track, barely discernible beneath a canopy so thick it swallowed the last of the afternoon light. Reid squinted, knuckles white on the steering wheel, the map a crumpled, useless thing on the passenger seat. He hadn't seen another vehicle, or even a sign of human passage, for hours. Then, just as he considered turning back, a thought he immediately dismissed, determined as he was to see this through, the trees thinned slightly. A clearing opened, choked with weeds and saplings, and there it stood. The cabin. It was older than he'd imagined, a hunched, gray thing with timbers weathered to the color of bone. Moss clung to the roof shingles, and the windows, dark and vacant, seemed to watch him without expression. A porch, its planks warped and sagging, ran across the front, half obscured by an overgrown vine. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence was profound, broken only by the chirping of unseen insects and the rustle of leaves in a breeze that felt ancient. This was it. His inheritance. Stepping out, the ground felt soft under his boots, a carpet of fallen leaves and damp soil. The air was still, thick with the smell of decay and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood or forgotten iron. He dragged his duffel bag from the truck bed, the weight of familiar comfort, and approached the cabin. The front door, a heavy slab of dark wood, resisted at first, then groaned open on rusted hinges, revealing an interior steeped in gloom. He ran a hand over a table, leaving a clean streak in the thick layer of dust. The place was a time capsule, untouched for years. His first task was to air it out, to chase away the stagnation. He propped the door open and moved to the windows, wrestling with their stiff latches, forcing them open one by one. As he unpacked, his footsteps echoed oddly on the bare floorboards. He was alone, deep in the woods, in a very old house. Of course, it would make noises. The wind would whistle through cracks, the wood would settle. He told himself this with a conviction that felt a little too forced. He spent the rest of the day in a flurry of activity, sweeping away cobwebs, wiping down surfaces, and setting up a makeshift bed in what appeared to be the main living area. As evening descended, painting the small window panes in shades of bruised purple and gray, the sounds of the cabin intensified. A persistent tap-tap-tap started from somewhere upstairs, like a branch brushing against glass, but there were no trees close enough to reach the roof. The sound ceased the moment he reached the top of the creaking stairs. Later, as he stirred a simple meal of canned beans over the stove, a floorboard creaked distinctly behind him. He spun around, skillet in hand, but the room was empty. Just the house settling, he muttered aloud, the sound of his own voice startling in the quiet. He tried to rationalize it, but a prickle of unease started to spread beneath his skin, an unwelcome guest. He needed to understand what he had inherited. In a small, dusty study off the main room, he found a sturdy, locked oak chest tucked beneath a sagging bookshelf. The key was hidden beneath a loose floorboard nearby, just as the estate lawyer's notes had indicated. The pages, brittle and smelling faintly of dried herbs, were filled with a cramped, spidery script. He picked it up, the leather cool and smooth beneath his fingertips, a sense of gravity settling over him. This felt important. Before he could properly delve into the journal, he remembered the need for signal. He'd barely had a bar since leaving the paved road. The estate lawyer had mentioned a landmark, a way to orient himself, and perhaps get a stronger signal. He packed a small bag and headed back out, the journal tucked securely in his duffel. The drive further down the winding, overgrown track was even more precarious than the one to the cabin. After another hour of slow, jarring progress, the trees finally gave way to a wider, slightly elevated clearing. There it stood, a dilapidated weather station. Its skeletal anemometer, rusted and bent, pointed a skeletal finger at the sky. The small, corrugated iron shed that housed its equipment was collapsing in on itself, one wall caved in. It was a monument to abandonment, to things left to rot. He pulled out his phone, and to his surprise, a single bar of signal flickered to life. He managed to send a quick text, a simple "arrived." All good to a colleague, a lie to soothe the growing unease. The wind picked up, rattling the loose metal of the station, and he distinctly heard, over the creak of the structure, a faint, almost musical hum, coming from deep within the woods. It wasn't a natural sound. He dismissed it, again, as the wind, as the old station, as his own overactive imagination, but the seed of doubt, now watered, had begun to sprout. He glanced back at the dense forest, feeling the familiar weight of unseen eyes. The pickup finally lurched to a halt, its engine dying with a shuddering sigh. Reid sat for a moment, the silence of the forest pressing in, thick and immediate. Before him, the cabin loomed, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. It was larger than he remembered from the estate photos, its windows like vacant eyes staring out from beneath a sagging brow of eaves. He'd brought a few rations, a sleeping bag, and a sturdy flashlight, but the cabin offered little comfort. The air inside was stale, a forgotten scent of dust, decay, and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid, like old blood, or perhaps just rust. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing peeling wallpaper, a thick layer of grime on everything, and the ghosts of lives long gone. He flipped through a few pages, the script spidery and faded, but nothing immediately jumped out. He decided to tackle it in daylight. The next morning, the unease solidified. He'd woken to the distinct sound of a door closing downstairs, a soft thud that vibrated through the floorboards. He'd gone down, flashlight ready, to find the heavy oak front door still bolted from the inside. He checked every window, every cupboard. Nothing amiss. But the memory of the sound gnawed at him. When he turned, the dense foliage was still, silent. The cabin seemed to breathe around him. The floorboards groaned when no one walked on them. The faint scent of something like withered roses, sickly sweet, would drift through the main room, only to vanish as quickly as it appeared. One evening, as he was trying to light the old wood stove, a small porcelain figurine, a shepherdess with a chipped crook, toppled from a mantelpiece and shattered on the hearth. He hadn't touched it. It had simply, inexplicably, fallen. He was alone. He had to be alone. Yet, the cabin was not empty. He started to sleep less, jumpier, his nerves frayed by the constant, subtle assaults on his perception. He'd whirl around, flashlight beam sweeping the empty room, his breath catching in his throat. He couldn't rationalize it anymore. The settling house, the wind, his imagination, none of it explained the shepherdess, or the distinct thud of the door, or the persistent feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the reach of his senses. Reid knew he needed answers. The relative, the cabin, the land itself, it all felt connected. He remembered an old, isolated weather station a few miles back, off the main road. He'd seen it on a map once, marked as a historical site, mostly abandoned but with an old-timer rumored to still keep an eye on it. It was his best bet for local records, for anything that might shed light on this place. The drive was jarring, the truck rattling over the uneven track. He felt a desperate urgency now, a need to escape the cabin's suffocating presence, if only for a few hours. The weather station stood on a small, windswept clearing, a cluster of weathered wooden buildings surrounding a tall, rusted anemometer. Smoke curled lazily from a squat chimney. The man looked up, his eyes a startlingly clear blue in his weathered face. "I'm Reid." He slowly straightened, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "The Reid cabin, you mean? It's been empty a long time. Heard your relative passed." His voice was gravelly, low. "Yes. I was hoping you might have some old records, maps maybe? Anything about the history of the land, or the cabin itself." The old man nodded slowly, then gestured to a corner crammed with dusty filing cabinets and sagging shelves. "Might be something. People used to bring all sorts of things here. Local history, family papers, old surveys. This was the only place with a strongbox for miles back then." He paused, his gaze lingering on Reid. "Lot of stories about that land. Always have been." Reid spent the next few hours sifting through brittle, yellowed documents. The air in the weather station was thick with the smell of old paper and dust, a welcome change from the cabin's metallic tang. Tucked into a ledger detailing rainfall statistics from the 1930s, he found it, a single, loose page, brittle and brown. It was a fragment of a journal entry, written in the same spidery hand as the one he'd seen back at the cabin. "The agreement must be honored. The blood demands its due. Our lineage is bound, generation after generation. The firstborn, they say, is always the strongest sacrifice, though the others are not without their power. The veil thins. It hungers. And I fear the time is drawing near again. May God have mercy on our souls, for we have none left to give." Reid's breath hitched. The blood demands its due. The old man, who had been quietly watching him from his workbench, cleared his throat. "Find anything interesting?" he asked, his voice devoid of any real curiosity, more a statement than a question. Reid looked up, the brittle page clutched in his hand. He met the old man's knowing gaze, and in those clear blue eyes, he saw not just history, but a deep, weary understanding of the horror he was only just beginning to uncover. The cabin wasn't just old, it was cursed. And his family, it seemed, was inextricably tied to that curse. He folded the page carefully, his fingers trembling. The phenomena weren't random. They were a prelude. And he was standing directly in the path of whatever ancient, hungry thing was awakening. He had to go back. The words were a cold, sharp blade, carving through his carefully constructed rationalizations. The blood demands its due. Our lineage is bound. The old man, who had been quietly watching him from the porch swing, simply shook his head, a deep, sorrowful sigh escaping his lips. His gaze, ancient and heavy, seemed to bore into Reid, seeing not just him, but generations. "Some things are better left buried, young man," the old man rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across stone. "But some things, they don't stay buried." He pushed himself slowly from the swing, his joints protesting with soft clicks. "You've stirred it, haven't you? Or it's stirred you?" He shuffled towards the edge of the porch, then stopped, turning back. "Been there since before the roads were paved. The attendant there. He knows more than he lets on. He's seen things. Heard things. If anyone can give you answers, it's him." He didn't want answers, he needed them. The cabin felt like a trap, its walls pressing in, the air thick with unspoken history. The drive north was a descent into deeper wilderness. The narrow dirt track, barely wide enough for his vehicle, wound through towering pines that clawed at the sky, their branches forming a dense, sun-dappled canopy. The further he drove, the more the world seemed to shrink, closing in around him. Finally, a break in the trees revealed a clearing. There it stood, the weather station. It wasn't a modern, sleek structure, but a squat, weathered building of gray concrete and rusted metal, looking like a relic forgotten by time. A tall, skeletal anemometer spun lazily atop a mast, its metal veins groaning faintly in the sparse breeze. Wires snaked from the building into the surrounding undergrowth, disappearing into the tangle of ferns and moss-covered rocks. Reid parked, killed the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening, amplified by the vastness of the forest. He could hear the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, the distant caw of a crow, and the insistent, almost rhythmic thrumming that seemed to resonate in his bones. As he approached the weather station's heavy, steel-plated door, it creaked open. A figure emerged, silhouetted against the dim interior. It was an old man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes a startlingly pale blue that seemed to hold the weight of decades. He wore a faded, patched work jacket, and his hands, gnarled and thick-fingered, clutched a steaming mug. He looked at Reid, not with surprise, but with an expression of weary expectation. "Figured you'd show up eventually," the station attendant said, his voice gravelly but steady. "The old man from the cabin. He told me to find you." The attendant nodded slowly, taking a sip from his mug. "He sent you, did he? Good. Saves me the trouble of waiting for you to stumble into something worse." He gestured with his head. "Come in. It's..." The air was thick with the smell of dust, old electronics, and something earthy, like damp soil. The attendant led him to a small, cluttered office, pushing aside stacks of yellowed charts to clear a space on a worn wooden table. "Sit," he commanded, pointing to a rickety chair. "You've got questions. I've got answers, though you might not like them." Reid sat, his mind racing. The cabin. The things happening there. The message I found. The blood demands its due. What does it mean? The attendant leaned back, his pale eyes fixed on Reid. "It means your ancestors, the ones who built that cabin, they made a pact. Not with a demon, not with the devil, not with anything you'd find in a book of fables. They made a pact with the land itself. This forest, this particular patch of earth where your cabin sits, it's old. Older than any record. There's something beneath it, something hungry. Something that existed long before man scratched out his first dwelling. Your lineage, they found it. They disturbed it. And they tried to control it. Reid's mouth was dry. Control it? How? Through a ritual, the attendant explained, his gaze distant, as if seeing events from centuries past. A cyclical offering. The blood of the line. Your family, they were caretakers, wardens. They fed it, kept it dormant. The cabin, it's not just a house. It's a key. A conduit. And the message you found? That's its hunger. It's waking up because the offering stopped. Your distant relative, the one who died. He was the last one who understood the burden. The cabin, his inheritance, wasn't just a place, it was a cage, a sacrifice altar. The entity wasn't a ghost or a poltergeist, it was something ancient, primal, bound to the very earth. And his blood, his lineage, was not a blessing, but a curse. It means it's coming for you, boy, the attendant finished, his voice devoid of pity. You're the last of the line. And it's very, very hungry. The hum from the machinery in the room seemed to deepen, to resonate with the low thrumming Reid had felt outside, a hungry vibration that now felt like it was emanating from deep within his own chest. The attendant's words still echoed, a chilling symphony of revelation that left Reid's mind reeling. His lineage wasn't a blessing, but a curse, a bloodline tethered to something ancient and malevolent. He stood in the living room, the space now seeming to breathe around him, no longer just wood and stone, but bone and sinew. A faint, acrid scent, like damp. Earth mixed with something metallic and old, began to permeate the air, tightening his chest. It wasn't just outside anymore, it was inside him, in his throat, coating his tongue. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. He felt it press down, a crushing weight that made his knees buckle. The floorboards beneath his feet shifted, not with the settling of an old house, but with a deliberate, grinding motion, as if the very foundation was twisting. A faint, guttural sound, like stones grating against each other deep underground, vibrated through the soles of his boots. He clutched the lamp, its warmth the only anchor in a world suddenly unmoored. The walls seemed to pulse, their rough-hewn logs appearing to ripple, the grain momentarily blurring into something organic and grotesque, like stretched skin. He squeezed his eyes shut, then opened them. This was no longer a haunting, it was a siege. He couldn't stay here, not without understanding more. The attendant had spoken of ancient things, of earthbound entities. He needed data, old maps, anything that might shed light on this land, on his family's forgotten history. His mind latched onto the one place that might hold such records, the local weather station, a small, isolated outpost he'd seen marked on an old county map. They dealt with more than just temperature and rainfall, they often had historical, geological and atmospheric data, sometimes even obscure local lore. The drive was a blur of heightened senses. The trees pressed in, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the car. The usual chirping of insects was muted, replaced by a low, constant hum that seemed to emanate from the very ground. He found the weather station tucked away on a small hill, a stark, utilitarian building bristling with antennas and meteorological instruments. A single, aging pickup truck was parked outside. He pushed open the heavy metal door, the sound echoing in the quiet interior. Reid tried to sound casual, though his heart hammered against his ribs. Yes, I was hoping you might have some old records. I'm researching the history of my family's land, just a few miles from here. I heard this area has some. Interesting geological features, maybe unusual weather patterns in the past? The technician's eyes narrowed slightly. Interesting is one word for it. What kind of records are you looking for? Anything really. Old seismic reports, atmospheric anomalies, even local folklore about the land itself. My property is near the old Blackwood Grove. A flicker of something, recognition, unease, crossed the technician's face. He turned to an ancient computer terminal, its screen a dull green. Blackwood Grove. Yes, we have some peculiar readings on file for that specific grid coordinate. Goes back decades, even centuries, if you cross-reference with the Geological Survey archives. He typed slowly, his fingers hesitating over certain keys. Localized energy spikes. Not seismic, not electromagnetic in a typical sense. More like a bleed. A constant, low-level thrum that occasionally surges. We used to call them earth tremors in old reports, but they didn't match any known fault lines. He paused, adjusting his glasses. And the atmospheric data. Strange localized pressure drops. Not storms, just pockets of intense, rapid changes. Always centered on that exact area. He clicked a few more times. There's also a record of. Well, it's not official. More like an addendum from a previous technician, decades ago. Mentions a local family, the Kardashians. No, that's not right. Kardashian. No, it's Carvanian. Yes, the Carvanians. Said they were the original landholders. And there are some very old reports, predating this station, of unexplained disappearances in that area, almost cyclical. Always around the solstices or equinoxes. The last big cluster was Carvanian. That was his mother's maiden name, a name he barely remembered, a distant branch of the family tree he'd never explored. He was a Carvanian. And the disappearances, cyclical, a generation ago. Some theorized a rare mineral deposit, others a natural geothermal vent. But the old-timers, the ones who were here before me, they had another theory. They said the land itself was hungry. And that the Carvanians were its keepers. Or its prey. A sharp, metallic screech ripped through the station, making them both jump. The lights flickered violently, and the computer screen went black. A low hum, far more intense than before, vibrated through the floor. Reid's ears popped, and the acrid, metallic smell from the cabin flooded his senses, stronger now, almost suffocating. He saw the technician's eyes widen in fear. "What was that?" the man gasped. Reid didn't answer. For a terrifying second, the blinking lights on the console transformed into a multitude of eyes, glaring at him, ancient and malevolent. He blinked, hard. The eyes were gone, replaced by the mundane electronics. But the message was clear. The entity was here, outside the cabin, asserting its claim. It knew he was seeking answers. He stumbled back, muttering a hurried thanks, and practically fled the station. The forest pressed in tighter, the hum from the ground now a distinct, rhythmic pulse, like a vast, unseen heart beating beneath the earth. As he neared the cabin, a dense, unnatural fog had descended, swirling around the clearing. The fog seemed to writhe, tendrils reaching for the car, for him. He was a Carvanian, bound to this land, to this hunger. The cabin wasn't just a cage, it was his inheritance, and it was demanding its due. Escape was no longer a possibility, it was an illusion. He was trapped, and the entity, now fully awake and aware, was coming for him. A sharp, metallic screech ripped through the station, making them both jump. He could almost taste the damp, ancient earth, the decay of forgotten things. The station technician, a man whose face was usually etched with a calm, almost bored efficiency, was now a mask of bewildered concern. What in the? The backup generators should have kicked in instantly. He scrambled towards a panel on the wall, his fingers fumbling with switches. The emergency lights, dim yellow squares, stuttered on, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters. The hum intensified, a low, guttural thrumming that seemed to resonate in Reid's very bones. "It's not just the power," Reid heard himself say, his voice thin and reedy in the oppressive quiet. "It's something else." He pointed at the black computer screen, then at the technician's radio, which sat inert on a desk, a dead rectangle of plastic. "Try the radio. Or your phone." The technician pulled a small, battered handset from his pocket. He stared at the blank screen, then shook it vigorously. Dead. Completely dead. He tried the station's landline, the rotary dial clicking uselessly, producing no tone. The only sound was the persistent, deep hum, a vibration that seemed to penetrate the very concrete of the building. This wasn't just a power outage affecting the remote weather station. This was the thing. It had followed him. It had found him. Its reach was far wider, its grasp far stronger than he had dared to imagine. He had come here for help, for answers, for escape, and instead, he had merely provided a new vector for its influence. "We have to go," Reid urged, his voice tight. "We can't stay here. It's not safe." The technician, still visibly shaken, nodded slowly. "No signal, no power. Reid can't even log the anomaly. This is unprecedented." He grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight from a hook, its beam cutting a stark path through the gloom. The service road. It's a rough track, but it leads back to the main trail. It's our only way out. Reid didn't wait. He was already moving towards the heavy steel door that led outside. He breathed deeply, trying to clear his lungs, but the lingering scent of decay still clung to him. The sky overhead was a bruised purple, heavy with unspoken threats. They plunged into the tree line, the technician leading the way. With the powerful beam of his flashlight. The service road was indeed rough, little more than two muddy ruts carved into the earth, overgrown with tenacious weeds. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves, made Reid jump. The path felt unfamiliar. They weren't there. The trees, too, seemed to press in closer, their branches forming a tangled, impenetrable canopy that swallowed the last vestiges of twilight. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Reid asked, his voice cracking slightly. The technician paused, sweeping the flashlight beam around. His face was pale, drawn. "It should be. I've taken this path hundreds of times." He tried to sound confident, but a tremor in his voice betrayed him. "There's a clear marker. A fallen oak, just past that rise. We should have seen it by now." They pressed on, but the fallen oak never materialized. Instead, the path began to narrow, the ruts disappearing entirely, replaced by a carpet of moss and tangled roots. The trees grew thicker, their trunks impossibly wide, their branches weaving together like a grotesque, living cage. The forest wasn't just unfamiliar, it felt wrong. He could hear the faint murmur of water, a sound he vaguely remembered from the direction of the cabin, not the main road. His breathing grew shallow, ragged. His mind, already teetering on the edge, began to play tricks. The acrid, metallic smell was now undeniable, thick and cloying. "We're going in circles," Reid gasped, grabbing the technician's arm. "This isn't the way out." "This is. It's leading us back." The technician shone his light ahead, and his breath hitched. Through a gap in the gnarled trees, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the flashlight, stood a massive, twisted oak. Its uppermost branches, skeletal against the bruised sky, seemed to claw at the heavens. Reid had seen them before. On the cabin's hearth. On the locket he'd found. The mark of the pact. The entity wasn't just present in the cabin, it was the forest. It had twisted the very path beneath their feet, weaving a labyrinth designed to ensnare. There was no escaping its reach. He was caught, utterly and irrevocably. It wasn't a sound of suffering, but of immense, ancient satisfaction. Reid felt a scream rising in his throat, but it caught, lodging like a stone. He was lost. His desperate measures had only deepened his entrapment. The forest was alive, and it wanted him. His sanity, a fragile thing, felt like it was finally beginning to splinter. The technician's light beam trembled, then dropped, bouncing once before settling on the dark, churned earth. His breath hitched, a strangled sound that caught in the frigid air. Through a gap in the gnarled trees, bathed in the sickly yellow glow, stood the massive, twisted oak. At its base, half buried in the root-tangled soil, was a weathered, bone-like carving. It wasn't stone. Reid saw it clearly now. It was wood, shaped into a crude, anguished face, its mouth agape in a silent, eternal scream. A choked sound, half gasp, half whimper, escaped the technician. He didn't speak, didn't look at Reid. He simply turned and bolted, his heavy boots crushing fallen leaves, the sound rapidly fading into the oppressive silence. Reid stood frozen, the technician's forgotten flashlight a trembling beacon at his feet. He knew, with a certainty that iced his blood, that whatever the technician had seen or heard, it was more than just the carving. He bent, retrieved the flashlight, its beam now cutting a shaky path through the deepening gloom. He was alone. The thought was a lead weight in his stomach, but a strange, grim determination solidified in his chest. He had come too far. The path ahead was barely discernible, choked with thorny undergrowth and fallen branches. A faint, metallic tang, like old blood and wet iron, permeated the air, growing stronger with every step. Then, a structure emerged from the gloom, a small, dilapidated shack, its corrugated metal roof rusted to a deep, bruised orange. This was the weather station. One wall had partially collapsed, leaving a jagged maw that seemed to gape at the sky. Reid approached cautiously, his boots crunching on brittle leaves and twigs. The wind, which had been a low moan, now seemed to whistle through the gaps in the shack structure, a mournful, drawn-out cry. He pushed aside a piece of warped plywood that served as a makeshift door. Old instruments lay scattered on a warped wooden table, a rusted anemometer, a broken barometer, their faces frozen in time. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of moonlight that pierced a hole in the roof, illuminating a corner of the room. There, nestled amongst cobwebs and desiccated leaves, was a heavy, leather-bound journal. Reid's hand trembled as he reached for it. He opened it, the brittle pages groaning in protest. The handwriting was cramped, faded, but legible. It was the relative's journal, he was sure, filled with frantic, increasingly desperate entries. Then, he found it. The entries grew erratic, the script slanting wildly. It awakens. The hunger returns. Not just the land, but the blood. He turned the page. There was a crude drawing, the twisted oak, its roots depicted as grasping tendrils, reaching into the earth, and then upwards, toward a faint, shimmering outline of the cabin. And beneath the tree, the anguished face he had just seen carved into the wood. The pact. Not with the land, but with it. The ancestor, desperate, offered a lineage. A conduit. A feeding ground. The forest gives, but it takes more. It demands sustenance. Reid's breath hitched. Sustenance? What kind of sustenance? He flipped more pages, his heart hammering against his ribs. The narrative became less about observation and more about a terrifying, personal understanding. It's not just an ancient spirit. It's a parasitic hunger, an entity born of primordial fear and sacrifice, tied to this specific patch of earth, this specific bloodline. He was part of this. The cabin, the forest, his very presence here, it wasn't an inheritance, it was an invitation. Then, the true horror unveiled itself. An entry, dated just days before his relative's death, scrawled in a frantic hand, "The cycle completes. Every few generations. A life. A strong life. To appease the hunger, to keep the balance. It twists reality, it feeds on despair, it demands a final offering. My sacrifice was not enough. The pact requires a descendant. A willing heart, or one broken by its influence." Reid reread the words, his mind reeling. A descendant. The bloodline. His bloodline. The entity wasn't just a malevolent presence, it was a parasitic force, sustained by a generational pact, demanding a life, a strong life, from his family every few cycles. His relative's death wasn't mysterious, it was a desperate, failed attempt at an offering, or perhaps a warning. He looked around the crumbling weather station, suddenly seeing the instruments not as relics, but as silent witnesses to a long, horrific vigil. The wind howled outside, a sound that now seemed to carry a triumphant, predatory note. He understood. The entity's true nature was a primal, insatiable hunger, bound to his family by an ancient, terrible promise. And the sacrifice required to appease it, or perhaps to finally break free, was nothing less than a life from his own lineage. His life. He was not just an heir, he was the next offering. The air in the small station grew thick, heavy, as if the very walls were pressing in, eager to witness the final act of a generations-long horror. The words still burned behind Reid's eyes, a descendant. The bloodline. A strong life. His relative's death wasn't a mystery, it was a payment. A sacrifice. The weight of generations settled on his shoulders, a cold shroud. He felt a profound weariness, yet beneath it, a spark of something fierce ignited. Determination. He wouldn't be another name on a ledger of the dead. He wouldn't let this parasitic force consume him or anyone else. He remembered a fleeting mention in one of his relative's rambling journals, a barely legible sketch of a stylized weather vane beside a series of arcane symbols. The Watcher's Perch, it had been called. A place of old records, forgotten things. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but the cabin offered no answers, only hunger. The forest seemed to watch him, its ancient limbs reaching, grasping. He felt its presence, a subtle thrumming in the ground beneath his boots, a low hum that resonated with the gnawing dread in his gut. The path to the old weather station was barely a deer trail, overgrown and obscured by fallen branches. Each step was a battle against the thick undergrowth, the clinging vines that seemed to snag at his clothes with deliberate malice. The light, already fading, struggled to penetrate the dense canopy, casting the woods in perpetual twilight. Finally, after what felt like hours, a clearing opened before him. There it stood, the weather station. Not a modern structure, but an archaic tower of weathered timber and rusted metal, its instruments long since seized by corrosion. A wind vane, a barometer, an anemometer, all frozen in time, like skeletal fingers pointing to a sky that no longer cared. The building itself was a small, squat affair, mostly wood, listing precariously to one side. A single, grimy window stared out like a vacant eye. The door, a slab of splintered oak, groaned as he forced it open, revealing a single cramped room. The air was stale, thick with the smell of decay and old paper. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with decaying logbooks, charts brittle with age, and strange, archaic instruments he couldn't identify. He moved methodically, his breath catching in his throat with each creak of the floorboards. A wooden chest, bound with rusted iron straps. The lock was long broken, its hasp hanging limp. Inside, nestled amongst dried herbs and what looked like polished river stones, was a heavy, leather-bound book. Its cover was etched with the same symbols from his relative's journal. He pulled it out, the leather dry and cracked beneath his fingers. The pages within were not paper, but thin sheets of polished slate, covered in a precise, meticulous script and intricate diagrams. His hands trembled as he deciphered the ancient words, slowly piecing together the truth. This wasn't just a pact, it was a binding ritual, an ancient bargain struck by his ancestors with a primeval force of the land itself. Not for power or wealth, but for protection against something even older, something that stirred beneath the earth where the cabin now stood. The entity, the text revealed, was a guardian corrupted, its purpose twisted by generations of misinterpretations and offerings. It craved not just a strong life, but the essence of that life, the will, the spirit, to fuel its own fading power. And there, etched on the final slate, was the counter-ritual. Not a sacrifice of life, but a sacrifice of self, of the bloodline's claim, a severance. A reversal of the original bargain, requiring a specific arrangement of the river stones, a chant, and a drop of the bloodline's own essence, not to feed, but to sever the connection. The price was steep, the bloodline would forever be without the land's ancient protection, exposed to the older, forgotten horrors it had once guarded against. But it would be free. With the heavy book clutched in his hands, Reid stumbled out of the weather station, the forest now a gaping maw waiting to swallow him. The sun had dipped below the horizon, plunging the woods into an inky blackness. It knew. It sensed his purpose. He ran. The hum in the earth intensified, vibrating up his legs, rattling his teeth. Inside, the air was thick, suffocating. The temperature plummeted, and his breath plumed in the frigid space. The cabin groaned and shifted around him, a living, breathing thing. The furniture seemed to writhe, wood grain distorting, knots resembling screaming faces. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the floorboards, a sound that seemed to come from the very foundations of the earth. Reid ignored it all, his gaze fixed on the central hearth. The heart of the cabin. This was where the ritual had to be performed. The growl intensified, becoming a roar that shook the very walls. Dust and splinters rained down from the ceiling. It was the entity, fully manifested, its power overwhelming. You cannot break what is bound by blood. You are ours. He drew a small, crude knife from his pocket, the one he used for whittling, and pressed the blade against his palm. A bead of crimson welled up, bright and defiant against his skin. He squeezed, letting the drops fall onto the central stone, the ancient words of severance rasping from his dry throat. The entity shrieked, a sound that tore through the air, vibrating in his bones, threatening to shatter him. The cabin convulsed violently, beams groaning, windows shattering inward. He felt its icy touch, a parasitic drain on his very being, but he held firm, his eyes locked on the glowing stones, his voice rising in a desperate, unyielding chant. The crimson bead on Reid's palm grew, then stretched, a glistening thread that connected his skin to the rough surface of the largest standing stone. A low thrum vibrated through the floorboards, through the very soles of his worn boots. It wasn't a sound so much as a resonance, a deep, guttural hum that seemed to originate from the earth itself, rising through the cabin's foundations. The faint glow from the stones intensified, pulsing with a slow, deliberate beat, mirroring the throb in his wrist. He watched, mesmerized, as the thread of blood darkened, then seemed to retract, drawn into the stone as if by an unseen mouth. A shiver, colder than any winter draft, traced its way up his spine, raising gooseflesh. The insidious voices, which had been a cacophony just moments before, abruptly ceased. Reid's knees buckled. He wasn't sure if it was exhaustion or the sudden, profound shift in the cabin's atmosphere. He slumped to the floor, his back against the cool, rough wood of the central stone, his injured hand pressed instinctively to his chest. The wound itself was shallow, a sting more than a true cut, but the psychic drain was immense. He looked around the cabin. The walls no longer seemed to breathe, the corners no longer pulsed with unseen malice. It was just a cabin again, old and dusty, filled with the ordinary decay of neglect. But it wasn't truly ordinary. The air still held that strange, metallic tang. And the stones, though their intense glow had faded to a dull shimmer, still hummed faintly beneath his touch, a memory of the power they had consumed. What had he done? Had he truly banished the entity, or merely appeased it? He had made a pact, a desperate bargain with something ancient and unknowable. He had given a piece of himself, a drop of his very lifeblood, to sever a lineage of sacrifice. But the cost felt far greater than a mere cut. His mind felt stretched, thin, like overworked canvas. He had touched something vast and terrible, and it had left its indelible mark. The cabin was quiet now, too quiet. The floorboards didn't creak under his weight, the wind didn't howl through the gaps in the chinking. He needed to leave, to find proof that the world outside was still real, still tethered to the familiar. He stumbled out of the cabin, the crisp night air a shock against his feverish skin. The forest was still, the ancient trees standing sentinel, their branches skeletal against the sliver of moon. He didn't trust the quiet. He didn't trust anything. Days blurred into a hazy succession of exhaustion and paranoia. He couldn't go back to the world he knew, not yet. He felt tainted, irrevocably altered. He drove his truck aimlessly, the winding forest roads a labyrinth that seemed to lead nowhere but deeper into his own fractured mind. He found himself, almost by instinct, at the abandoned weather station. It stood on a high ridge, a skeletal tower of rusted metal reaching into the perpetually overcast sky, surrounded by a cluster of low, windowless outbuildings. He remembered seeing it on old maps, a relic from a forgotten era, long since decommissioned. The main building was a single room, surprisingly intact. A long, scarred wooden table dominated the center, cluttered with ancient, defunct equipment, a rusted barograph, its needle frozen in time, a cracked anemometer cup, coils of brittle wire. The air was dry, smelling of ozone and forgotten paper. He ran a hand over the smooth, cool metal of a disconnected radio console, his fingers brushing against a stack of yellowed logbooks. He picked one up, its cover brittle, the pages within filled with cramped, precise handwriting. Dates from decades past, observations about wind speed, temperature, atmospheric pressure. Routine, mundane data. But as he flipped through the pages, his gaze snagged on an entry, circled in faded red ink, dated almost exactly a century ago. It wasn't about weather. The wind outside picked up, rattling the loose metal sheeting on the roof, a sound like dry bones clattering. He was free, perhaps, but irrevocably bound to the knowledge of what lay beneath the quiet earth. Reid's breath hitched, the chill of the revelation seeping deeper than the damp air of the weather station. The words he'd found, scrawled and desperate, confirmed it. The horror wasn't confined to the cabin, or even to his family line. It permeated the very fabric of this forgotten land, a sickness woven into the soil, the roots, the very air. The wind outside howled, a mournful, hungry sound that seemed to mock his late understanding. The old records, brittle and yellowed, spoke of a pact not with some distant, unknowable force, but with the land itself, or the ancient, hungry thing that slumbered beneath it. His ancestors hadn't just built a cabin on a burial ground, they'd erected a monument to a forgotten bargain, offering up their sanity, their bloodline, to keep a greater darkness at bay. They were not merely victims, but wardens, and their sacrifices were not simply appeasements, but anchors. A tremor ran through him, not of fear, but of profound, bone-deep weariness. He wasn't meant to fight it, not in any conventional sense. He was meant to replace his predecessor, to become the next link in the chain, to resume the impossible task of containment. The cabin, the forest, his very inheritance, it was all a lure, a trap laid generations ago, finally sprung. He pushed himself away from the rickety table, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The air in the weather station, stale and tasting of dust and forgotten paper, suddenly felt too thin. He had two choices: embrace the feudal role, or sever the connection entirely. The latter, he knew, would mean an unleashing, a freedom for the entity that his ancestors had fought so desperately to prevent. But what was the alternative? To be consumed, like all the others? To pass this cursed legacy on to some unwitting descendant he might never even meet? Reid walked to the large, grimy window, peering out at the skeletal trees swaying in the biting wind. He could feel it, a low thrumming beneath the earth, a vibration in his teeth. It wasn't just hungry, it was a werestar. It was waiting. He would not be a warden. He would not be a sacrifice. He would break the chain. Returning to the cabin was a grim pilgrimage. The cabin loomed, a black silhouette against the bruised sky, its windows like vacant eyes. Inside, the silence was oppressive, a stark contrast to the cacophony of whispers and creaks that had tormented him for weeks. The entity was no longer playing games. It was watching, waiting for his move. He walked through the familiar, terrifying rooms, a strange resolve hardening his features. He didn't come to fight. He came to leave. In the main room, where so much had twisted and broken, he paused. There was nothing here for him. He found a small, tarnished silver locket he'd carried, a gift from a distant relative he'd never known, the very one who had passed the cabin to him. He'd kept it as a morbid curiosity. Now, he saw it for what it truly was, another link. He turned, not looking back. He walked out of the cabin, the heavy wooden door closing behind him with a resonant thud that echoed through the forest. It wasn't a lock or a barrier, but a statement. He was leaving. He was refusing. The walk out of the forest was a blur of aching muscles and a mind stretched taut. He didn't run. When he finally emerged onto the gravel road, where his vehicle waited, dusty and forgotten, the setting sun painted the horizon in hues of bruised purple and blood orange. The air felt cleaner, sharper, yet still carried a faint, almost imperceptible metallic tang. He got into the vehicle, started the engine, and drove away without a backward glance. The world outside the forest felt both familiar and utterly alien. The trees, the sky, the distant hum of civilization, all seemed subtly altered, stripped of a layer of perceived safety. He carried the knowledge, the understanding of what lay dormant, or perhaps now, fully awake, back in that forgotten corner of the world. Reid knew he would never be the same. The horror hadn't consumed him, but it had carved a permanent space within him. He had survived, but he was forever changed, forever marked. The pact was broken, and he had paid the price, a silent, internal sacrifice that would haunt him until his final breath. And sometimes, in the dead of night, he wondered if the real horror wasn't what he'd left behind, but what he'd carried out with him.